On November 8, 2013, at around 6 in the morning, Tacloban on the island of Leyte was already awake. The wind was hammering against rooftops. Families were gathering in schools, churches, and concrete buildings. Shops were closed, and the streets were almost empty. The day before, authorities had warned of an approaching monstrous typhoon, and many people were preparing specifically for the wind, reinforcing windows, moving belongings higher, searching for stronger walls. Some managed to evacuate. Others decided to ride out the storm at home. But the forecasts also contained two other words: storm surge. To meteorologists, they meant a deadly threat. To many residents, they meant almost nothing. Some imagined unusually high waves. Others thought of heavy rain. Some believed a concrete house would be enough. Outside, the wind was roaring, while the sea was already beginning to rise. Not slowly, like an ordinary tide. It was preparing to enter the city almost all at once. And within just a few hours, those two misunderstood words would become one of the main reasons why a warned city would prove completely unprepared for what was coming. Several days earlier, Haiyan had appeared on satellite images like a perfectly organized machine. Over the exceptionally warm waters of the western Pacific Ocean, the storm intensified with terrifying speed, building a dense wall of clouds around a tiny, almost flawless eye. By the time it approached the Philippines, estimates of sustained wind speed reached roughly 315 kilometers per hour. It was one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever observed at landfall. Meteorologists saw the danger in advance. Warnings were issued, evacuations were organized, and residents stocked up on water and food. But the extreme wind was about to do something else. It would press against the surface of the ocean and drive an enormous mass of water toward the coast of Leyte. Hearing that a super typhoon is approaching is one thing. Understanding that the wind can physically raise the sea and force it into city streets is something entirely different. That was exactly what Haiyan was preparing to do, and Tacloban's coastline lay almost directly in its path. At around 4:40 in the morning, Haiyan made its first landfall near Guiuan in eastern Samar. It moved quickly, leaving almost no time between the first impact and the next. Roofs began tearing away in entire sheets, trees bent almost to the ground, and debris became flying projectiles. The storm then continued westward across the central islands of the country. In Tacloban, located beside San Pedro Bay, conditions were becoming especially dangerous. The geography of the city was working against it. Low-lying coastal districts sat directly in the path of the water being driven toward shore. Inside homes and shelters, people heard blows against the walls, the cracking of metal, and the thunder of roofs being ripped away. It seemed as though the worst had already begun. But the wind was only the first half of the disaster. Behind it was a mass of water as high as a 2-story building. The storm was approaching, and the shape of the bay was helping funnel the water toward land. When the sea entered the city, the familiar boundary between coastline and streets disappeared within minutes. At first, water appeared on the roads. Then it began rising so quickly that many people did not have time to understand what was happening. The current burst into houses, smashed through doors, lifted furniture, vehicles, and pieces of roofing. In places where people had been sheltering from the wind on the ground floor just minutes earlier, they were suddenly forced to climb staircases, cabinets, rooftops, beams, and window bars. In parts of Tacloban and the surrounding coastline, the storm surge reached roughly 5 to 6 meters. Water pushed hundreds of meters inland, turning low-lying neighborhoods into raging channels of mud, timber, metal, and debris. Even some buildings chosen as shelters were flooded. Cars, walls, and sections of roofs were swept through the streets. The water did not arrive like an ordinary flood. It struck with the force of a moving sea. This was the moment when the meaning of the warning became clear. A storm surge was not simply high surf. It was the ocean coming for the city. and by then, there was almost nowhere left to retreat. But then, the situation became even worse. Haiyan did not simply flood the coast. At the same time, it destroyed nearly everything that could have helped after the impact. Electricity vanished, mobile communications failed, roads were blocked by trees and debris, and emergency vehicles could barely move. Wind shattered windows, while water carried away equipment, documents, food, and fuel supplies. Communication between Tacloban and the outside world was effectively severed at the exact moment the city needed help most. With roads and networks destroyed, it became almost impossible to understand quickly which districts had suffered the worst damage and where people were still trapped. Those who survived the first surge did not know whether another rise in water was coming. Some moved from house to house across piles of wreckage. Others searched for children and relatives among devastated neighborhoods. As the water began to withdraw, it left streets buried so deeply in debris that the familiar city became almost unrecognizable. Survivors compared what they saw to the aftermath of a tsunami. During those hours, survival often depended on chance. The height of a staircase, the strength of a roof, the distance from the shoreline, or the decision to move one floor higher just a few minutes earlier. Some families survived by reaching upper stories. Others clung to rafters while water rushed through their homes. Neighbors pulled one another from the current. Strangers lifted children onto rooftops. And medical workers continued helping people, even as hospitals themselves were damaged and cut off from supplies. For many, survival meant holding on for only a few more minutes, until the water finally stopped rising. But there were also places where early evacuation saved almost everyone. People there had left the coast before the typhoon arrived, and had not waited to see visual proof of the danger. That contrast would later become one of the central lessons of Haiyan. The forecast existed, the warning existed. There had been time to prepare. But between receiving a warning and truly understanding it, there was a deadly gap. When daylight returned, the scale of the destruction revealed itself gradually. From the air, coastal districts looked as if an enormous current had passed through them, erasing the boundaries of streets. Homes had been stripped down to their foundations, vehicles lay piled on top of one another, ships had been thrown onto land, and Tacloban Airport had been badly damaged and flooded. Familiar landmarks no longer worked as points of reference. Where entire neighborhoods had once stood, there were now continuous fields of wreckage. Across the Philippines, more than 6,000 people were killed and millions were forced from their homes. In Tacloban and nearby coastal areas, the overwhelming majority of deaths were linked to the storm surge. The disaster affected a vast portion of the central Philippines, while relief had to be delivered through shattered infrastructure. But the most disturbing detail was something else. The water had not been a surprise to science. It had been expected. The technical warning simply had not become, for every resident, a clear image of what it actually meant for their home, their street, and their family. After Haiyan, the Philippines reconsidered warning systems, evacuation procedures, and the way danger was explained to the public. A technical term was not enough. It was not enough to say storm surge if people had never seen such a phenomenon and could not imagine what those words meant in practical terms. A warning has to answer not only what is coming, but a more important question. What exactly will people see when it arrives, and where must they go before it is too late? Today, the story of Haiyan remains a reminder of the limits of even modern forecasting. We can see a typhoon from space. We can calculate its path. We can estimate its winds. We can warn a city hours or even days in advance. But if the final link in that chain, the person receiving the warning, does not understand what is actually about to happen, all of that technology can still fail. On November 8th, 2013, Tacloban survived more than one of the strongest typhoons in history. It survived a moment when the distance between knowing about a threat and truly understanding it became a deadly gap measured in only a few words.